We're tackling a really fascinating subject today. Chopin's Piano Concertos. Now, these are pieces you've almost certainly heard, probably enjoyed, but maybe didn't realize they have this, well, quite controversial history.
That's right. It's a real paradox. On the one hand, they've been incredibly popular staples of the repertoire, really, since they were written back in 1829, 1830.
Absolutely beloved, concert halls, recordings, everywhere.
Exactly. Huge success with audiences and performers for nearly 2 centuries.
And yet, and this is the kicker, they've also faced some seriously harsh criticism from music scholars over the years, often sort of dismissed as juvenilia.
Yeah, sometimes seen as, maybe not quite as deep or sophisticated as the solo piano works he wrote later in his career.
So what gives? Why this huge disconnect? How can music be so popular, so enduringly loved, and yet critically kind of sidelined?
Well, a lot of it comes down to how you judge them. The criticism often applies standards that weren't really relevant back then, or it looks at them purely as notes on a page, like abstract forms.
Rather than music for performance.
Precisely. And the source we're using for this deep dive, John Rink's book, Chopin, the Piano Concertos, makes a strong case that if you look at them as music to be performed in their actual historical context, well, they're remarkably successful.
How so?
They create deep emotion. They showcase this incredibly unique and innovative piano writing, writing that really points towards the genius we hear later. They worked brilliantly in the concert halls of their time.
So the book's aim, and really our aim in this whole series, is to kind of set the record straight, as Rink puts it.
Exactly. It's about reevaluating them not through the lens of later academic fashions, but by understanding the musical world, the traditions, the tastes of the early 19th century, Chopin's world.
Right.
Because only then can you really appreciate their outstanding qualities on their own terms.
It's like, imagine finding a recipe for some revolutionary dish from decades ago. If you just look at the ingredients without knowing the cooking methods they used, the tools they had, what people actually liked back then, you'd completely miss the point, wouldn't you?
That's a great analogy. You'd miss the genius of it.
So that's our mission for this first part, setting the stage, understanding the ingredients the musical world Chopin lived in, and his own journey leading up to writing these concertos.
Welcome to Piano Night Studio, a podcast where music, piano, and literature come together. Here, we explore the stories behind the notes, the lives of composers and performers, and the books that have shaped the musical world. Whether you're a pianist, a passionate listener, or simply someone who finds beauty in the sound of a single note, this space is for you. In each episode, we go through ideas, emotions, and the timeless connection between music and words. Thank you for joining us.
Early 19th century Europe, the source calls it a time of fundamental upheavals. How did that translate into the music scene?
Well, it was a period of massive change for music. You had new genres popping up or becoming much more important. There was this huge boom in public concerts, opera too, driven largely by the rising middle class.
A new audience, basically.
A powerful new audience and a huge market. And this era saw the real rise of the professional touring virtuoso, a big expansion in music publishing, and really crucial developments in instrument building.
And the piano was right in the middle of all that.
Absolutely central. It was, as the book says, at the heart of this expanding musical world. Think of Vienna, Mozart, Beethoven, then Hummel, Moscheles. It was a hub.
Okay.
But then Paris just exploded. The poet Heine had that amazing phrase about keyboard virtuosos descending on Paris like swarms of locusts.
Swarms of locusts, wow. And those technical advances in the piano itself, like Erard's double escapement, how did that play in?
Oh, critically important. That was patented in 1821. It allowed for much faster repetition of notes, which basically opened the door for whole new levels of technical brilliance.
Yeah.
And improvements like that also made pianos more practical for, smaller spaces. So they started entering middle-class homes much more widely.
Which created a market.
A huge market, not just for the flashy virtuoso stuff, but also for simpler arrangements, pieces for teaching, for home use.
So virtuosity was really king then. in the concert world at least.
Very much so. Keyboard virtuosity and opera were kind of the two main pillars of public musical entertainment. Now, some critics, like Schumann, were a bit worried about this focus on, just dazzling technique.
I thought it was superficial.
Yeah, potentially superficial, maybe taking away from serious composition. But even Schumann admitted the best virtuoso music had real charm and skill. And our source definitely pushes back against the idea that it was all just cliche-ridden meretricious claptrap. There was real substance there, too.
Tell us about the composer-pianists. What was their typical role?
They were performers first, really. They wrote music mainly for themselves, for their own concerts, for immediate use.
Not necessarily thinking about posterity?
Not in the same way a symphonist might have been. They needed repertoire for the current season. So they churned out concertos, rondos, variations on popular tunes, fantasies, potpourri, and crucially, improvisations were a huge part of their act.
Improvisation.
Their concerts were often these kind of smorgasbord-like events, mixing genres, maybe featuring other performers, but always showcasing the star composer-pianist and their latest works.
And the concerto genre itself, how did it change in that environment?
It adapted quite a bit. The orchestra's role often became, less central or complex than in, say, a Mozart or Beethoven concerto. Partly for practical reasons, you might be performing with a smaller group.
Okay.
So the traditional dialogue, the back and forth between soloist and orchestra started to shift. The contrast and the drama often got integrated more within the solo piano part itself.
So the piano was kind of carrying its own drama.
In many ways, yes. Earlier ideas of contrast were often about texture, the big orchestra versus the lone soloist. By Chopin's time, while harmonic contrast was still absolutely vital, there was also this real focus on thematic drama, thematic development, often driven primarily by the pianist.
Interesting.
Czerny, who was a major pianist and teacher then, described a common first movement structure. 4 orchestral bits, the tutti, interspersed with 3 long solo sections. It's not quite the old classical double exposition, but it's a model that really puts the focus on the soloist's journey.
And that reflects the priorities of the time.
Absolutely, that aesthetic shift towards melody and showcasing the star performer.
And what about opera? You mentioned its influence was huge.
Oh, massively influential. Grand opera shared that same focus on brilliant soloists, on expressing big emotions, portraying characters and moods, very sort of hard-on-sleeve emotionalism.
You hear that in the concertos.
Definitely. You start seeing actual operatic devices creep in. Cadenzas, the big solo flourishes, were always there. But you also get things like instrumental recitatives, dramatic, speech-like passages in concertos by Michelis, and in Chopin's F minor, too. It echoes earlier things like Mozart's K271, but became much more common.
Wow.
And the style of melody, very lyrical, very ornamented, was often directly inspired by Italian bel canto singing, both for the piano and sometimes even for the orchestral themes.
So Chopin, as a young man in Warsaw, he wasn't just reading about this stuff, he was living it.
Completely immersed, he was constantly going to concerts, and he actually performed concertos by many of the big names: Gyrowetz, Ries, Hummel, Michelis, Kalkbrenner. He knew Weber's music, Field's music.
So he had firsthand experience.
Absolutely. He knew the concerto idiom of his day inside out. That characteristic alternation between the lyrical themes, that what one scholar calls the poetry, and the brilliant passage work, the display. And there was a kind of typical pattern, especially for the first movement: an orchestral intro setting out the themes, then the first big solo section full of virtuosity moving to a new key. Later sections would develop that material or bring it back, often building to a really stirring conclusion, almost like an opera finale.
Right.
Slow movements were often more song-like, sometimes shorter, and third movements were usually rondos, designed to end with a bang. Lots of dazzling passage work.
And that dazzling technique, the brilliant style, what did that actually involve? What kind of piano playing?
Oh, it was all about showing off what the pianist could do. Incredibly fast scales, all kinds of scales, arpeggios sweeping up and down the keyboard, rapid repeated notes, which the new pianos made easier, daring leaps, octaves, intricate patterns using thirds, sixths, basically anything to put the spotlight squarely on the soloist's fingers.
Okay, so that's the vibrant, fast-changing musical world. Now let's focus on Chopin himself. How did his path in Warsaw prepare him to write these concertos?
Well, his very first pieces, like the polonaises he wrote when he was just 7, they're amazing for a child, but they don't yet sound completely like Chopin, not like the later Op. 26 Polonaise, for instance. He really served a kind of apprenticeship in Warsaw before he headed off to Paris. And Warsaw wasn't some musical backwater, despite what some people might assume. Poland, under Russian rule since 1815, actually had a period of relative stability then.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, it allowed the arts and sciences to really flourish. New institutions were founded, music publishing was growing. You could get Polish editions of Hummel, Field, Ries arrangements of the latest operas Chopin heard at the National Theater.
So he had access to current music.
Definitely. And Warsaw attracted big international stars on tour. Hummel himself visited, the great pianist Maria Simonowska, famous singers like Catalani and Sontag, even Paganini. Seeing these people perform live must have really fired up Chopin's own ambitions. Pieces he wrote during this Warsaw period, the solo rondos, the famous variations on Mozart's Lacidarum, the fantasy on Polish airs, the rondo alla Krakowiak, and then finally the 2 piano concertos. That was basically his calling card, his portfolio, when he left Warsaw for good in November 1830.
What about his formal training? How was he taught?
Well, his piano teaching was a bit unusual. His first teacher, Zaini, was actually a violinist, but he instilled a love of Bach and Mozart. He got some later guidings from Wilhelm Werfel, a pianist and composer. But honestly, as a pianist, Chopin was largely self-taught.
Really?
Which probably explains why his keyboard style became so incredibly personal, so idiosyncratic. It was all about beauty of sound, amazing nuance, that famous legato, suppleness, elegance, color.
But his composition training was more structured.
Oh yes, much more formal. He studied privately with Joseph Elsner, then enrolled properly at the Central School of Music under him. Elsner gave him a really solid grounding in counterpoint, harmony, thorough bass, even rhetoric and aesthetics, drawing on 18th century ideas. This source says Elsner recognized his pupil's genius and maybe indulged him sometimes, letting him skip certain exercises. But he absolutely insisted that Chopin master orchestration in large-scale form. And apparently Elsner even sanctioned calculated experiments.
Ah, that's crucial, isn't it? Because it touches on that question again. Were the slightly unusual formal things in the concertos, especially the E minor, signs of youthful ignorance, or were they maybe deliberate sanctioned experiments?
Exactly. The source strongly suggests they could well have been deliberate explorations, maybe even encouraged by Elsner as part of mastering his craft. It reframes them from potential flaws to potential innovations.
Did he travel much before leaving Poland?
He did. He went to Berlin in 1828, heard lots of opera, Handel too. That broadened his horizons. But the really key trick was his first visit to Vienna in August 1829.
That went well.
It was a big success. He played his Lacidarum variations, the rondo alla Krakowiak, and improvised. And importantly, a reviewer back then already picked up on his originality, writing about a spark of genius, unique forms, and striking individuality. So people noticed he was doing something different even early on.
And improvisation, you mentioned, it was important for composer-pianists generally, but what about for Chopin specifically?
It seems to have been absolutely central to his musical thinking. Yes, improvising on national melodies was standard practice for virtuosos. But for Chopin, it tapped into something deeper, his real connection to Polish folk music, the mazurkas, obereks, kujowiaks he heard on summer trips to the countryside.
Right, the folk idioms.
Those rhythms, those melodic turns, along with the more aristocratic polonaise he knew from Warsaw society, they seeped into everything. His mazurkas, obviously, his waltzes, but also the concertos. And the source really stresses that improvisation wasn't just performing for him. He composed at the piano, working things out, refining passages. He was famous for his improvisations, both in public and private settings.
Okay, so pulling these threads together, we've got opera, virtuoso pianism, Polish national idioms, his love for Bach and Mozart, his formal training, and this constant improvisation. How did they all converge in the concertos?
The source places the concertos within that category of post-classical concert music or style brillante we talked about. They definitely share characteristics with other pieces in that style.
But they're different somehow.
Yes, they really stand out. Some of his earlier brilliant pieces had a more straightforward, alternate, here's the theme, here's the flashy bit, and could sometimes feel a bit, well, eclectic. But in the concertos, he achieved a greater synthesis. And you can really track the evolution of his passage work. In some earlier pieces, the brilliant figuration could feel a bit aimless, maybe rhythmically heavy. The source calls it a leaden phrase, rhythm sometimes.
Huh?
But by the time you get to the fantasy on Polish airs, Opus 13, or the Rondo alla Krakowiak, or Opus 14, there's much more control, more sense of direction and momentum. And crucially, in the concertos, the virtuosity isn't just there for show, It assumes an expressive role. It feels completely integrated, flowing naturally from his unique keyboard touch, that suppleness and facility.
Were there specific things in earlier works that pointed towards the concertos?
Definitely. You can look at the original orchestral introductions he wrote for Opus 1314, even the Opus 2 variations. Or think about those driving sequential calls in octaves in the introduction to the Opus 22 Grandi Polonaise. They really anticipate gestures that build energy in the concerto finales. He was already getting better at using finales for energy, building towards a strong conclusion, developing a better sense of structural weight, and writing more effective codas. And harmonically, there were already flashes of boldness, things like parallel diminished sevenths, striking chromatic passages over pedal points. And interestingly, the way he handles key structures in the concerto seems to draw less from the standard concerto model and more from his private works, like the early C minor sonata, Opus 4, or the piano trio, Opus 8.
How so?
Those pieces sometimes had quite unorthodox structures, things like monotonal expositions or bringing back the main themes in the recapitulation but not in the home key initially. So again, that debate, ignorance or experiment. The source leans towards experiment, suggesting these explorations in smaller forms led to the more dynamic, goal-directed progressions we find in the concertos.
And this concept of ornamental melody that sounds key to his style.
It's fundamental. Think about his early E minor nocturne, Opus 72, number 1. Those incredibly elaborate runs and decorations, they aren't just sprinkled on top of the tune, they are the tune. The embellishment is the melody.
Ah, I see.
He really developed this in his polonaises, making the melody itself highly ornamented. And this profoundly influenced the lyrical themes in the concertos, especially in the slow movements, but the first movements too. They sing, but with this incredible decorative richness woven right in. The third movements, the finales, are a bit different though. They draw more on techniques you hear in his mazurkas, this almost obsessive repetition and development of tiny rhythmic or melodic fragments, tiny cells. It helps create a sense of organic unity beneath all the brilliance.
So bringing it all together, these concertos were more than just useful efforts.
For the 20-year-old Chopin, they represented a new level of artistry. He wasn't just adopting the fashionable style brillante, he was, in a way, perfecting it, infusing it with his unique expressive depth. That ornamental melody was refined, his control over musical shape and momentum was fully realized, creating this profound synthesis of detail and whole. They really distill all the influences, virtuosity, opera, folk music, classical training, improvisation into his own unmistakable, unique stylistic voice. And importantly, the source stresses that Chopin himself knew it. He recognized his achievement.
So, thinking about all this context, what does it mean for us as listeners approaching these pieces today? We've seen the musical whirlwind he came from, the specific things that shaped him, and how these concertos weren't just random pieces, but this careful synthesis pushing boundaries.
Yeah, understanding that background really can change how you hear them. It helps you appreciate that features later critics sometimes flagged as, maybe weaknesses, were often actually rooted in the way music was made and heard back then. They were often innovative steps for Chopin, not signs of immaturity.
So why should you, the listener, care about all this context? Well, because it can genuinely transform the experience. They stop being just pretty tunes or impressive fingerwork. They become living products of a really dynamic, revolutionary time in music history. You hear a young composer finding his utterly unique voice by drawing on everything around him. It makes him sound, I think, really fresh and exciting again.
Absolutely. And now that we've sort of set the scene, explored the world and Chopin's background, we know where we're heading next. We'll follow the book into the story of how these pieces were actually composed, their first performances, how Chopin used them to launch his international career,
Right.
and the really surprising, sometimes controversial ways they've been interpreted, edited, and performed over the last 2 centuries. There's so much more to the story.
Creation. We should probably start with the F minor concerto, Opus 21, even though the opus number is higher.
That's the one. Bit of a quirk there. It got published later, after Opus 11, the E minor. But yes, F minor was definitely composed first.
And the spark for it, especially that gorgeous slow movement, the larghetto, that was quite personal, wasn't it?
Oh, absolutely. The source points straight to Konstancja Gładkowska, a young singer Chopin admired.
Ah, the muse.
Pretty much. He actually wrote to his friend Titus Wojciechowski about it. This is back in October 1829. Called her his ideal, who had inspired that movement.
Classic artist story. So was he getting feedback while he was writing it?
He was. His teacher, Eisner, heard the adagio, the slow movement, around October 20th, 1829, and apparently thought it was really original.
High praise from his teacher.
But Chopin, well, he was always tough on himself. The source says at that point he wasn't satisfied with the rondo, the final movement.
Interesting. He had issues with the finale. We might see that again. So how long did it take to finish? When did it hit the stage?
Well, he mentioned the finale was still not quite there in mid-November 29, but fast forward a few months and boom, March 17th, 1830, first public performance.
At the Teatr Narodowy in Warsaw.
That's the one. Conducted by Karpinski. This was effectively Chopin's big Warsaw debut as a concerto soloist. Huge moment for him.
And how'd it go down?
Immediate hit. Despite any, last-minute nerve Chopin might have had, it was so successful they actually scheduled a repeat performance just days later, March 22nd.
Wow.
And for that second performance, they apparently used a bigger piano, maybe one with more resonance, perhaps trying to fill the hall better or address some sound issues from the first night.
Okay, so F minor makes its splash in Warsaw. But meanwhile, the E minor concerto, Opus 11, wasn't far behind, was it?
Not at all. He was already working on it while the F minor buzz was happening.
Right. The source mentions a letter from March 27th, 1830.
Yes, saying he'd finished the first allegro before the holidays, and then by mid-May, May 15th, that first movement was done, and so was the second movement.
And that second movement, the romance, his own description of it is just beautiful. What did he say? How did he picture it?
He wrote, it wasn't meant for a, quote, powerful effect. He saw it more as a romance, calm, and melancholy, giving you the feeling of someone looking gently towards a place that brings back a thousand happy memories.
That really paints a picture for you, the listener. And didn't he describe the atmosphere even more?
It did. Called it a kind of reverie in the moonlight on a beautiful spring evening. Pure poetry.
Amazing.
And what's really cool, a super specific detail the source gives us, is how he wanted the orchestra to sound. He actually wrote instructions, hence the accompaniment is muted.
Muted violins. How?
That is, the violins are muffled by a sort of comb which fits over the strings and gives them a nasal and silvery tone.
Wow. A comb. That specific detail tells you so much about the sound he was hearing in his head.
Exactly. It really brings his vision to life, knowing he wanted that precise, almost ethereal texture for the romance.
So when was the E minor fully finished?
The source says by the end of August 1830, and his friend, Józef Lanowski, copied out the orchestral parts.
Maybe because Chopin's own handwriting could be a bit wild.
Possibly. Maybe learning from past experiences with hard-to-read manuscripts.
And even then, even when it was finished, he still had those pre-premiere jitters.
Oh, yeah. Classic Chopin, maybe. There's a letter from September 22nd, 1830, where he says he feels this second concerto is far too original.
Too original. He worried people wouldn't get it.
Or maybe even that he wouldn't be able to learn it properly himself. That's what he wrote. But, he did also say the rondo was effective and the first allegro impressive.
So confidence mixed with apprehension. Standard artist stuff.
Yeah.
And the premiere.
Followed pretty quickly, October 11th, 1830.
Okay, so hearing how close together these were written, it makes sense the source talks about structural similarities.
Absolutely. He was working with consistent models, writing quickly, so yeah, there are definite parallels.
Both have that classic three-movement concerto structure, right? Fast, slow, fast.
Correct. First movement's maestoso for the F minor, allegro maestoso for the E minor. They use that traditional back and forth between the full orchestra, the tutti, and the solo piano sections.
But the book stresses his solo writing wasn't just showing off.
Exactly. All those fast scales and arpeggios, the passage work, it wasn't just empty fireworks. It was meant to be expressive, almost like singing through the piano.
And the slow movements, often compared to his nocturnes.
They definitely have that lyrical, intimate feel. The F minor's larghetto is sort of an ABA form with a very dramatic, speech-like piano solo section, a recitative.
Right.
The E minor's romance larghetto is a bit more complex, maybe like a rondo itself with the main theme coming back between different episodes.
And the finales, they bring in his Polish roots.
The F minor finale uses themes that feel like a mazurka, that Polish folk dance.
Okay.
And the E minor rondo is based on the Krakowiak, another Polish dance, this one known for its syncopated, catchy rhythms. Both finales alternate themes and episodes, building up to a big, brilliant finish.
Now, one of the real challenges, as the source points out, is understanding how he actually composed these.
Yeah.
Because there isn't much original manuscript material left.
It's a huge gap, honestly. The book calls the surviving material for the E minor almost non-existent from that time. For the F minor, it's only somewhat more abundant. Still not a lot.
So we don't have, like, his working drafts, the full scores he was writing.
Very, very little. That's a complete autograph,
Yeah.
entirely in his handwriting from that early composition period. For the F minor, we've got just tiny fragments. A few bars scribbled on a sheet that also has a sketch for his piano trio.
Okay.
And there's a piano arrangement of the orchestral part for the slow movement and finale, but that was made by his friend Julian Fontana, probably just for them to play together or for Fontana to study.
And the source mentions one document for the F minor that's interesting, if problematic, from later on.
Right. This is a partial autograph score, probably from the mid-1830s. The orchestral parts are written by someone else, an unknown copyist. Then Chopin himself added the solo piano part.
Why problematic?
Well, there's a lot of debate about what this document was. Was it used as the master copy des Vorlage for the German first edition? We just don't know for sure.
And for the E minor, even less exists from that time.
Pretty much. The only known autograph source from the composition period is actually a piano reduction Chopin made of the first orchestral tutti.
Just the opening orchestra part, arranged for piano.
Yes, he prepared it for the solo piano version that was published later, and interestingly, it's slightly different from the orchestral part that eventually got printed. There's also a second piano reduction of the orchestra part for the second and third movements, made by the cellist Auguste Franchomme. Again, probably for rehearsing or teaching.
Because Chopin himself usually performed these with orchestra or maybe chamber groups, not often with a second piano.
Generally, yes.
Okay.
His public gigs were with orchestra, or especially later in Paris, sometimes with a smaller group, like a string quintet.
Speaking of gigs, the source mentions he didn't actually perform in public all that much. Fewer than 24 times in his whole career.
That's right. Pretty small number, really. And about half of those featured one of these concertos. The E minor, Opus 11, kind of became his go-to piece, his warhorse.
So after the Warsaw premieres in 1830, where did the E minor concerto get played?
It traveled a bit. Breslau in November 1830, then Vienna, June 1831, Munich in August 31, and then it became really central to his early years in Paris, plus that Rouen concert later in 38.
But the big one, the career maker, had to be his Paris debut.
Absolutely crucial. February 26, 1832, Salons de Pleyel.
And the source clarifies it was the E minor, Opus 11, not the F minor, as sometimes thought.
Yes, definitely the E minor, and probably performed with just a string quintet accompanying him, not the full orchestra that time.
And the impact was just huge.
Totally transformative. It cemented his reputation in Paris practically overnight. Publishing offers started rolling, and Ferenc Schlesinger, the big names.
And his connection with Pleyel pianos started then, too.
Yes, a lifelong relationship began there. Plus, it opened doors to all the top salons, got him connected, and crucially, it boosted his teaching practice, which became his main income stream.
The critic Fettis said it caused as much astonishment as pleasure because of the novelty. Captures it well.
It does, that sense of something completely new and exciting. The E minor had a few more key Paris outings.
Right, like the first movement with orchestra in May 32?
Yeah, though Fettis thought that one was less well received than the debut. Than just the slow movement and finale, Adagio e Rondo, in April 33.
And the romance on its own got a famous performance.
December 1834, Le Pianiste magazine called it ravishing.
And wasn't there that amazing quote from Berlioz about it?
Oh yeah, really poetic. Berlioz wrote that it plunged the listeners into a sort of calm and ecstatic joy, and each note fell like a pearl into a golden vase. Just stunning imagery.
Incredible. But his final Paris performance of the complete E minor with orchestra, April 1835, that didn't end so well for him personally.
It seems not. Even though it got a positive review, apparently in his publisher's own journal, Chopin himself was left feeling bitterly disappointed.
A turning point.
The source suggests so. It seems to be around then that he largely gave up the ambition of being a touring composer-pianist playing his big orchestral works in public. It's telling, isn't it, that he never played the F minor concerto publicly in Paris, or his other orchestral pieces.
And after that, his public concerts became even rarer. Never again with orchestra after playing the Grand Polonaise later in April 35.
pretty much withdrew from that kind of public performance life.
Okay, so let's shift from the stage to the critics' corner. How were these concertos actually received initially? What did the reviews say?
It's a mixed bag looking at the sources, especially comparing Warsaw to elsewhere. For the F minor premiere in Warsaw, March 1830, Chopin himself wrote that he felt the general audience didn't quite get the first allegro.
But the other movements.
The adagio and rondo, he said, drew exclamations of sincere admiration. So, immediate appreciation for those.
And some of the Warsaw reviews were really glowing, weren't they?
Oh, absolutely. The Pausechnidziana Krajoli praised the harmony, the beautiful melodies on a well-proportioned harmonic foundation, how smoothly the orchestra and solo blended.
And that quote about his performance style.
Right, saying he prioritized music. This is not me, this is music. The Courier Rosowski loved the adagio. The Courier Polski praised the unity of his writing and playing, the depth of feeling, the sheer skill.
And that idea that his playing sounded improvised came up early, too.
Yes, the Courier Polski mentioned that after the repeat F minor show, said he always brings forth something new, fresh in a word, inspired, like it was flowing right out of him. They also liked that the orchestra supported didn't drown out the piano.
How about the E minor's reception in Warsaw, October 1830?
Well, there was huge enthusiasm after a private rehearsal. People called it a hashtag work of genius, praised its originality, grace, orchestration, his playing.
Sounds great.
Chopin himself reported the rondo was seen as most attractive, maybe because, as he put it, it is easiest to understand. Krupinski liked its originality, Eisner liked the rhythm.
But the actual press coverage after the public premiere was quieter.
Surprisingly so. The source suggests maybe political censorship was tightening then. The only known review just called it one of the most sublime of all musical works. Nice, but not the detailed raves the F minor got. Chopin, though, felt he played really well with the orchestra, and the audience liked his playing.
Okay, so Warsaw was generally positive, especially for the F minor. What about when he played them in Germany?
A bit more varied. In Breslau, they liked his light touch, but weren't as wowed by the composition itself, though one expert noted its novelty of form. A Vienna critic thought he was a little too free with his tempi, maybe an early reaction to his rubato, that flexibility with time.
Right, challenging expectations.
And a Munich review praised his outstanding virtuosity and lovely delicacy, but felt the E minor was brilliant without much originality or depth, except for parts of the rondo.
Interesting mix.
Though Chopin himself later claimed audiences in the Rhineland and Bavaria could not praise highly enough, so maybe opinions varied or reviews didn't capture everything.
Then back to Paris, and that really important Fedis review of the debut. It had both good and bad points.
Very much so. Fedis was impressed by the novelty, the soulful melodies, the imaginative piano writing, the overall originality. He thought Chopin played elegantly, effortlessly. But he also pointed out what he saw as weaknesses. Things like over-rich modulations, maybe too many key changes for his taste, and a disordered succession of phrases, which again made him think it sounded a bit like improvisation.
That improvisation idea again. Maybe not always a compliment from critics back then.
Likely not, especially for those used to stricter classical forms. It probably reflects Chopin's unique, fluid style clashing with convention, but later Paris reaction seemed more consistently positive. That ravishing reception for the Romance in 34.
Right.
And the review of the full concerto in 35 praised its originality, how it rejuvenated such an old form.
And finally, that Rouen concert in 1838.
Ernest Legouve writing about it, just pure enthusiasm, immense praise. He talked about ravishing melodies, indescribable delicacies, the sheer poetry of both the playing and the music itself. Sounds like it really connected there.
Okay, so they've been composed, performed, reviewed. How did they actually get into print? That publication journey seems complicated too.
It was, definitely, partly because of the manuscript situation we talked about and also just the way publishing worked internationally then. The E minor, Opus 11, actually came out first in 1833.
Even though it was written second.
Right. The F minor, Opus 21, followed in 1836. The source suggests this delay was probably for commercial reasons, let the E minor establish itself first.
And he needed editions in different countries all at once.
Pretty much. To get copyright protection, you needed simultaneous publication or near simultaneous in the main markets: Paris, Leipzig for Germany, and London.
What versions of Opus 11 could you buy from Schlesinger in Paris back in 33?
You had choices: a solo piano version with the orchestra parts all reduced for piano, an avec orchestra version, which was just the individual orchestral parts, no full score yet, and a version with quintet accompaniment string parts, plus cues for winds and brass.
Given the lack of original manuscripts, how sure are we that these published versions are exactly what Chopin played in, say, his Paris debut?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And the source is clear. We can't be entirely sure. Without that complete autograph from 1830-32, the Schlesinger edition might not perfectly match what he played.
And there were other issues. Potential cuts?
Yeah, the source mentions talk of a possible cut suggested by the pianist Kalkbrenner, though whether Chopin used it is uncertain, and some early sources seem to be missing a cadenza. Lots of little questions.
And having different editions in France, Germany, and England just adds more layers.
Absolutely. The German edition by Kistner and the English one by Wessel were likely based on corrected proofs from the French Schlesinger edition. Things happen. Engravers make mistakes, editors might tweak things, maybe Chopin himself made tiny changes for different editions, so you end up with variance between them.
Different notes, different dynamics.
Exactly. Which makes life tricky for modern editors trying to create a definitive score, and for performers wanting to be historically informed.
And the F minor, Opus 21, published in 36. Similar issues.
Pretty similar. Published by Breitkopf and Hartel in Germany, Wessel in England, Schlesinger in France. Again, we don't know precisely which manuscripts were used as the Stichvorlagen, the master copies for engraving.
But there might be connections between them.
Probably. It seems likely Wessel in London worked from Schlesinger's proofs from Paris.
And that partial autograph we discussed earlier might be relevant for the F minor's German edition.
That's the conjecture the source explores. Since the German Breitkopf edition came out first, it might have influenced the others. And maybe, just maybe, that partial autograph, the one with Chopin's solo part, added to another copyist's orchestral score, served as a kind of secondary, more authoritative source just for Breitkopf.
Why would that matter?
It could explain why the Breitkopf edition has some unique readings, little differences not found in the Paris or London versions. It's speculative, the source admits, but it's one way to try and solve the puzzle of these variations.
So the big takeaway on publication is, it's complicated. And we can't be 100% certain the printed versions match the earliest performances.
That's pretty much it, especially for the F minor. Without an 1830 manuscript, the 1836 printed version might reflect changes made over those 6 years. It highlights what the source calls the continual evolution of Chopin's music, often shaped by his own playing and teaching.
Because these weren't just concert pieces for him, he used them in his teaching studio too.
Oh, extensively, especially the first movements. Many of his well-known students worked on them: Camille Dubois, Carl Filch, Jane Stirling, others mentioned in the text.
And there's that lovely detail about how he taught them.
Yes, accounts describe him accompanying the student. The student's on the grand piano, and Chopin's right next to them on a smaller cottage piano, playing the orchestral reduction himself, apparently most wonderfully.
Imagine that, learning the concerto with Chopin playing the orchestra part for you.
Incredible, right? And the markings he made in his students' scores, the glosses they tell us so much.
What kind of things?
Well, corrections, obviously, but also ongoing creative tweaks, little improvisatory variants, slightly different ways to play a passage, even years after composing it, plus detailed notes on dynamics, how to shape phrases, articulation.
And there was that really specific point about ornaments, the liaisons between the hands.
Yes, this is fascinating. Markings in Dubois' scores show he taught students to play the first note of a right-hand flourish, or arpeggio, exactly on the beat, together with the left-hand's note.
Not before the beat.
No, which was becoming the more common 19th century way. Playing it on the beat connects directly back to 18th century practice. It shows how rooted his technique and teaching still were in that earlier tradition.
That's a key detail. It places his style in a context people might not expect.
Totally. And the source points out other elements in the concertos that echo this 18th century legacy too.
Like what?
Things like fioriture and gruppetti, those fast, decorative, almost vocal runs. He taught they should start slow, then accelerate. Other embellishments needing real skill, but also that spark of spontaneous creativity. Specific types of slides, glissandos he called portamento or strascino. Effects where the piano seems to speak, parlando. Trills starting on the upper note. Long appoggiaturas. Even specific fingerings he marked. And of course his rubato, that rhythmic flexibility linked to Polish folk music.
And tying into the teaching, there's that amazing story about the rehearsal with the young prodigy, Carl Filch.
Wilhelm von Lenz's account, it's legendary, gives us such a vivid picture. Chopin telling Filch the pianist must be like a singer.
And he taught it piece by piece.
Yes, told Filch the whole first movement was too powerful for him to play through at once.
And Filch's preparation. fasting and prayer.
According to Lenz, yes. Fasting, prayer, and apparently not practicing right before the rehearsal. Then Chopin accompanied him on a second piano, playing the orchestra part from memory, creating something Lenz called incomparable, the experience of a lifetime for Lenz.
Wow. Despite the E minor being his public warhorse, the F minor held a special place too.
It seems so. The source says Opus 21 was particularly dear to Chopin's heart, and he had a marked predilection, a real fondness for its slow movement, apparently liked to play it often. Putting all this together, the specific ways he taught, the improvisatory elements, his whole unique performance style, the source makes a really interesting point about how these concertos might have fared after they left his immediate control.
That he might have been unhappy with later interpretations, troubled and perplexed.
That's the idea. That once the music was separated from his personal, unique performance aesthetic, him as the composer, performer, and teacher bringing it alive, the concertos often no longer communicated the expressive message he intended.
So those profound reactions, like Lenz had with Filch, became rarer.
Exactly. Something got lost in translation, perhaps.
So we've really covered a lot of ground today. The creation of these two incredible concertos, the ups and downs of their early reception.
That complex journey to print, navigating all the manuscript uncertainties and different editions.
And those fascinating glimpses into Chopin's own studio, how he played and taught these pieces, revealing those links back to earlier traditions and his constantly evolving ideas.
It really underscores that these aren't just notes on a page, are they? They're so tied up with his life, his inspirations, his specific way of making music.
Absolutely. Interpretation.
Okay, so let's start at the beginning then. What is interpretation in music? This source makes a pretty strong case that musical meaning is, well, inherently elusive.
Elusive. How so?
Well, it suggests a musical work continually evolves as it experiences successive interpretations. It's not fixed.
That's a powerful idea. It's not static at all. And the source argues that a work's ability to withstand a vast range of response without being sort of diminished,
Yeah.
that's a mark of its value.
Precisely. These Chopin concertos are called truly great works exactly because they invite new and different interpretations. They have this enduring richness.
So they want people to interpret them differently over time.
In a way, yes. Their depth allows for it. The source points out the extraordinary diversity in Chopin's reception over the last 150 years or so.
Wow. And why is that? Why so diverse?
Well, one reason given is the relative non-specificity of his music's expressive language.
Non-specificity, meaning
Meaning, unlike a composer like Liszt, maybe, who might write overtly programmatic music, music that tells a specific story.
right, like a tone poem or something.
Exactly. Chopin's music is often more open to personal meaning. It doesn't always spell out a concrete narrative.
Ah, okay. So programmatic music has that external story, while Chopin's is more abstract, letting listeners kind of find their own story or feeling in it. Is that it?
That's a good way to think about it, yeah. And we can see this play out in the historical patterns of criticism the source lays out.
Okay, what patterns?
In the mid to late 19th century, responses were often highly personalized. Critics tended to poeticize or programmatize it. They were trying to translate the music into a narrative, maybe historical or biographical, using metaphor or analogy.
So they were describing the sounds with stories and images.
Pretty much. They were really attempting to capture in prose the sense and experience of music as sound, focused on the feeling, the emotional impact.
Right, what it felt like to listen.
Yes. But then the source describes quite a significant shift in the late 19th and into the 20th centuries.
Good.
This is where more standardized perceptual tools and the whole formalist aesthetic really gained ground. Thinkers like Hanslick and later analytical traditions like Schenkerian analysis.
And that formalist view, as I understand it, focuses more on the music itself, its structure, its architecture, how it's built, its inner construction defined in its own terms.
Exactly that. It became much more about analysis by eye, looking at the score's structure on the page.
Rather than by ear, just experiencing the sound.
Right. And for Chopin's concertos, which the source argues were really conceived with the medium of performance at heart, this shift, well, it had a negative consequence.
How so? What happened?
The source calls it a drama of separation. It says performance and text were prized apart.
Prized apart.
Yeah. The intense focus on abstract structure meant the living, breathing performance aspect, which seems so crucial to Chopin, got sidelined. It was less important in that view.
A drama of separation. That phrase really highlights the disconnect, doesn't it? Between academic analysis and the music as a performed art form.
It really does. But thankfully, the source does note that recent trends seem to be moving towards a greater fusion, maybe, and a synthesis of the subjective and the objective, trying to bring performance and text, structure and experience back together again.
Which seems important. And understanding this whole historical tension is pretty key then to appreciating the challenges people face when interpreting these concertos today.
Absolutely. So, moving from the general idea of interpretation to the specific, let's look at the critics themselves. What did they actually say about these concertos?
Okay.
The source reveals some fascinating early reactions, often from people who actually heard Chopin perform the works, before 1850.
How did they like?
They praise the concerto's originality, their abundance of imaginative ideas, the novelty of form, even the freshness and genius of the unconventional passage work, those elaborate runs and ornaments, the fioriture.
All right, the fioriture.
Mm.
Chopin's signature, almost.
Mm-hmm. But there were criticisms, too, even back then. Some found the harmonies overrich, noted what they saw as a lack of structural disorder, maybe too rambling for them, and they commented on Chopin's own delicate, some called it a weak sound, and the rather heavy orchestration.
Interesting. So even hearing him play, it wasn't universal praise for every aspect.
No, not entirely. But overall, when they heard Chopin himself, the effect was generally described positively. Words like grace, elegance, beauty come up. They emphasized expression over just, empty virtuosity.
Like an improvisation, the source mentioned.
Yes, that feeling comes across. But then the source notes that later critical writing from around 1850 onwards, after the scores were published and other people started playing them, well, that often brought less favorable opinions. The focus shifted.
Ah, okay. So hearing other people play it changed things, and the criticisms got pretty harsh, didn't they? The source highlights some really scathing English reviews.
Oh, absolutely scathing is the word. The musical magazine branding Up 11, a compound of filthy sounds with passages that out-Herod everything of the kind.
Filthy sounds. Wow.
They called it altogether beneath criticism, just dismissed it.
And that memorable quote,
A farrago of nonsense and caterwauling.
farrago of nonsense and caterwauling, that is intense. It really shows how hearing the score, perhaps without understanding or hearing Chopin's intended expressive performance, led to wildly different reactions.
It certainly suggests that. Now, alongside this extreme view, the source also tracks the emergence of more analytical approaches. People like Fink, Stoppel, even Schumann tried to describe the structure or emotional logic.
Okay, so not all negative then.
No, but it's figures like Lenz, and particularly Friedrich Nietzsche writing in 1888, who had a really huge influence. They kind of solidified what would become the standard criticisms for decades.
Nietzsche, right. And his view is quite specific, isn't it? The source goes into detail there.
Very specific. Nietzsche basically believed Chopin lacked the peculiar qualities requisite for a successful cultivation of the larger forms. He thought his arguments, his musical ideas were poor, and that Chopin lacked sustained and dominating intellectual power.
Ouch.
And he also thought Chopin had no aptitude for orchestral writing at all.
Okay, this sounds like the core of that formalist critique we discussed earlier, focusing on structure and development.
It absolutely is. But Nietzsche, interestingly, found a saving grace. He found it in the detail.
The details.
Yeah, he praised the charm, loveliness, delicacy, elegance, and brilliancy of the details, saying these made one again and again forgive and forget their shortcomings as wholes.
Ah, so the little moments were beautiful, but the overall picture was flawed in his view.
Exactly. His most famous summary quote captures this perfectly. What a pity that Chopin should have set so many beautiful thoughts and fancies in such a frame and thereby marred them.
Marred them. That single phrase from Nietzsche. It really seemed to set the tone, didn't it? Influencing lots of authors afterwards.
Massively influential. The source says it led directly or indirectly to a coalescence of critical response into three recurrent, almost inevitable criticisms. One, poor control of form and tonal structure.
Right.
Two, lack of development and organic unity.
Right.
And three, inept orchestration.
The big three criticisms.
Pretty much. And always with that grudging acknowledgement that the beauty of the detail, especially the ornamentation, was the saving grace, compensating for these perceived formal weaknesses.
So in the critical imagination, the concertos became almost defined by these structural weaknesses. But the source also mentions figures like Merkel and Kretschmar, who had more positive, sort of performance-centric views.
Yes, they represent the other side, the experiential view, seeing the concertos as live phenomena. Merkel noted their profound effect when performed in the spirit of their creator.
Bringing performance back in.
Exactly. And Kretschmar defended Chopin's formal approach as innovative, seeing how the virtuosity wasn't just flashy but could serve a poetic idea.
This really highlights that dichotomy the source talks about. Seeing the music on a slab, inert and inanimate, through that formalist lens versus experiencing it in living sound. And the source argues that formalist view has maybe made us undervalue these works, calling for us to revitalize them by understanding Chopin's own goals and performance aesthetic, where work and performance are inseparably fused.
Which leads us perfectly to the next layer, because before the music even gets performed, it's shaped by another crucial interpretation: the score itself. The printed notes.
The score is an interpretation. That still seems a bit counterintuitive. Isn't the score just the composer's instructions?
Not always so simple, especially with works from this period. The source points out that scores, particularly edited ones prepared after the initial composition, are themselves interpretations.
Okay.
It even applies that pattern of dispersal to closure here too, how interpretation might start freely with variations, and later editors try to solidify it into a single correct version.
Meaning differences and maybe mistakes crept in over time as people published new editions.
Exactly that. Even during Chopin's lifetime, minor changes appeared in different printings. But more significant, sometimes quite fundamental changes occurred after the copyright expired, about 10 years after Chopin died, as publishers rushed out new editions.
And some of these editorial decisions actually introduced outright errors that just stuck around.
Yes, unfortunately. The source highlights Kistner's 11 edition from around 1858 as a key example, even though it misleadingly kept the original plate numbers, suggesting it was the same.
Sneaky.
Yeah. The music was entirely reset and introduced new editorial markings, including what the source calls inauthentic natural signs in the rondo, specifically in bars 233 and 235, before certain high C notes, C3s, which apparently plague editions to this day.
That's incredible. A tiny notation error from the 1850s is still showing up in scores people might use today.
It seems so. Then came the big wave of collected editions from around 1860 onward, dozens of them published.
And these are where editors really took more liberties, I gather, imposing their own ideas or trying to correct things they didn't like.
That's exactly it. Carl Kleinworth's edition, for instance, was called the Sole Edition Authentique, the only authentic edition, but the source says it was nothing of the kind. He was willfully adding or altering things.
Like what?
Well, the source gives the example of him inserting a contextually garish third inversion C7 chord in the first movement of Opus 21, bar 128, and he'd split up left-hand passages that Chopin wrote as a single gesture, just changing the texture.
So the editor was essentially rewriting bits of Chopin based on their own harmonic taste or pianistic ideas.
Pretty much. Or look at Hermann Schulze's edition from 1879. The source says it molds the notation according to the editor's performance strategy.
What does that mean in practice?
He'd take Chopin's flexible fioriture, those elaborate free-flowing runs, and parse them into rigid rhythmic groupings on the page. Made them look neat and convenient, maybe easier to read at first glance, but it totally destroyed their intended flexibility.
Imposing a strict rhythm where it should be freer.
Exactly. He even altered the key signature in the slow movement of Opus 11, the Romance bars 8100, to 4 flats, A flat major, just for facilitation to make it theoretically easier.
Wow, changing the key signature. But perhaps the most impactful example the source discusses is the Paderewski edition, the complete works, published between 1949 and 61. Super widely used, right?
Hugely popular, still is in many places. But despite that popularity, the source states quite bluntly it lacks scholarly authority and should be avoided by pianists.
Whoa. Okay. Why such a strong warning against such a common edition?
Well, the source explains it's due to a permissive conflation of secondary source material,
Meaning?
meaning they basically borrowed bits and pieces from lots of previous editions, including flawed ones like Clenworth and Schultz, almost as if saying, well, lots of editions did this, so it must be okay, or even best.
Popularity doesn't equal accuracy.
Not at all. And crucially, they apparently ignored important primary sources, like copies owned by Chopin's pupils, Jane Stirling and Camille Dubois. Plus, their own harmonic analyses influenced decisions about pitches and notation, trying to correct what they saw as Chopin's inconsistency or lack of clarity.
So they were fixing Chopin according to their own theories.
Seems like it. They altered slurring, which can destroy the natural phrasing or declamation, redistributed notes between the hands, and often ignored Chopin's own specific fingerings. The source is pretty clear. It distorts the original.
That's a really crucial warning for anyone using that edition. So what are considered more reliable options today, according to the source?
The source points to two: Zimmermann's edition of Op. 11, published by Henlin in 1989, and Jan Ekier's edition of Opus 21 from 1980-1985. These are seen as the best editions at present.
And they aim to be urtext, close to the original.
Yes, they style themselves as urtext, aiming for the composer's original intent. Though the source is careful to note that no single, perfectly authoritative version is truly possible because Chopin left multiple sources with variants.
Right. And even these best editions have some quirks.
A few, yeah. Zimmermann apparently includes some readings that could be considered questionable, though it's better than Paderewski. Ekier is called the best edition, eclectic but principled in its choices. The source quibbles that Ekier adds some rests that perpetuate a false tradition, started by Schultz, and frustratingly, his detailed critical commentary explaining all his editorial choices hasn't been published yet.
So you can't easily see why he made certain decisions. Still, sounds like Ekier is the top recommendation for Opus 21.
That seems to be the consensus in the source, yes.
Okay, moving beyond standard scores, the source also touches on transcriptions and arrangements, right?
Yeah, a long history there, even from Chopin's time, people arranging the concertos for different instruments or simplifying them. But perhaps more relevant to the core interpretation issues are the reorchestrations.
Reorchestrations, starting in the late 19th century.
Exactly. These were explicit attempts to fix Chopin's orchestration, which, as we heard, was one of those persistent criticisms Niecks and others hammered home.
Right. Figures like Tausig, Balakirev, Kleinworth tried their hand at improving the orchestra parts.
They did. And their common approach, often echoing that Niecks' criticism about lack of development, was to richly color and inflate out of proportion.
Inflate.
Yeah, basically adding melodies or counter-melodies for instruments like horns or woodwinds, often derived from piano themes, where Chopin had simply written sustained chords or even rests. They were trying to make the orchestral part more active or developmental according to their own standards.
So imposing their idea of what a concerto orchestra should be doing onto Chopin's fundamentally piano-centric work.
That's a very good way to put it. Balakirev, for example, in his version of Op. 11, would insert string and wind obligatos derived from the main themes into sections where Chopin didn't have them. Tausig's reorchestration of Op. 11 apparently recomposes substantial passages to the point of being almost unrecognizable as Chopin. Some of his variants are still sometimes played, apparently.
Unrecognizable. Wow. And what's the source's overall verdict on these reorchestration efforts?
Pretty blunt, actually. It says, occasionally these new orchestral touches work. In general, they strike the listener as risible distortions.
So the editors and reorchestrators, even maybe with good intentions, often ended up distorting the very music they were trying to present or improve.
Seems that way. And the conclusion the source draws here is really clear. These misinterpretations in the editions, these altered scores, inevitably provoke misinterpretations in sound when people play them. The music, embodied in many editions, is indeed worthy of disdain.
Powerful stuff. Which brings us, finally, to the actual performers, the people who sit down at the piano and try to make sense of all this.
Right, the final layer of interpretation. These concertos are absolutely central to the performance world, the canon. Over 70 recordings each, the source mentions.
And does that dispersal to closure pattern apply here too? Like more freedom early on, narrowing later?
The source suggests so, maybe more interpretative freedom earlier in the century versus a narrowing of acceptable performance practice more recently, partly influenced by the historical authenticity movement.
Interesting. And there were concerns even back then about how people were playing Chopin.
Oh, yes. The source mentions Chopin's own pupils, like Lenz, Mikuli, Zartriska, expressing concern late in the 19th century about a pseudo-tradition, developing things like unorthodox rubato, other stylistic errors that conflicted with how they remembered Chopin playing and teaching. They felt the way performance practice was evolving was actually inimical or harmful to these pieces.
But at the same time, the source is careful to state there was probably never been only one correct way to play.
Right.
Chopin himself seemed flexible.
Exactly. It emphasizes he tolerated a certain flexibility. It quotes his remark to a talented young student, Karl Filch. Play it your way. Do as you feel. It can go like that as well.
That's quite revealing. Do as you feel.
It is. And it quotes another report that Chopin played Mozart and Beethoven with the feeling of Chopin, achieving conviction without imposing himself. So the goal, according to the source, is a successful performance that finds a balance between the performer's conviction and fidelity to the score and style, where everything somehow adds up to a coherent interpretation that understands the necessary performance aesthetic.
Okay. And what are some common pitfalls or infractions, as the source calls them, that performers fall into with these concertos?
Well, things like sluggish tempos too slow, a harsh or hard-edged piano tone that lacks that singing quality, the bel canto cantabile that Chopin apparently favored, an orchestra that's either way too loud and overblown, or maybe too timid and underplayed, and maybe most famously, illogical or willful illogical rubato.
Ah, rubato. That characteristic push and pull of tempo, often associated with Chopin, getting that right must be tricky.
Very tricky. It needs to feel logical and expressive, not just random. The source then dives into specific performer examples, which is really illuminating.
Like who?
Well, early reportings, like Alexander Brilowski's 1928 Op. 11, the source describes it as having very arbitrary flexibility, undermining the music's logic, and using meretricious fioriture ornamentation that sounds maybe overly flashy or inappropriate.
And some performances are criticized for being too technical, maybe, or lacking expressive depth.
Yes, definitely. The source describes some more modern performances using words like playing metallically, suggesting a harsh sound. Others are described as skating over the music, implying a lack of depth or engagement. It's clear that just playing all the notes perfectly isn't enough for these pieces.
So who gets it right, according to the source? Who manages to capture that elusive feeling of Chopin?
Well, no single performance is perfect, of course, but the source does highlight a few standout interpretations. For Opus 11, the E minor concerto, Marta Argeric's recording with Claudio Abbado is singled out quite strongly.
What makes it special?
It's called one of the best interpretations on record, praised for being emotionally rich, with a varied orchestral sound from Abbado that really complements her consummate pianism. The source says everything indeed adds up, describing it as a true symbiotic partnership.
High praise indeed. And is that consistent across Argeric's recordings of Chopin concertos?
Interestingly, no. The source explicitly contrasts that successful Op. 11 with her recording of Opus 21, the F minor, with Rostropovich conducting. That one is called So Inept.
Inept, why?
Apparently, Rostropovich's orchestral tutti are huge and intrusive, and Argeric's piano tone comes across as strident. It really shows how much the partnership between soloist and orchestra matters, and how even great artists can have wildly different results depending on the context.
That's fascinating. Are there other performances that come close or capture something specific that the source mentions?
Yes, Maurizio Pollini's Opus 11 is described as nearly as captivating as the Arge Shabado. And for Opus 21, Stefan asks, not even close, it seems. It still comes down to the performer's deep understanding and skill in applying the correct aesthetic, the right feel. The overall summary of this performer section is that, sadly, few recordings truly manage to evoke the feeling of Chopin by fully embracing the performance aesthetic that was so vital to how these works were conceived and first heard in living sound.
Wow. So after this whole deep dive into the source's exploration of Chopin concertos, we've really seen this incredible multi-layered history of interpretation, haven't we?
Absolutely. From the wild swings and critical opinion. I mean, from genius to farrago of nonsense.
I forget that one.
Never. To the subtle and sometimes not so subtle ways editors have actually altered the scores over the decade.
Yeah, the corrections and improvements.
Right. And then on to the vast spectrum of performance attempts we just touched on. Some getting closer to that Chopin feeling, others, well, completely missing the mark, according to this analysis.
It really drives home the point the source started with, doesn't it?
Yeah.
That a musical work's meaning isn't just fixed in the score. It's constantly being negotiated, debated, recreated through criticism, editing, and especially performance.
Exactly. The score is a vital guide, obviously, but it's not the whole story. And every time someone interprets it, whether a critic writing, an editor deciding on a slur, or a pianist shaping a phrase, they are adding another layer to its ongoing history.
Absolutely.
Reevaluation. So the central idea, the thing guiding this whole reevaluation, it comes down to this fundamental tension in music. It's the pull between how music moves forward in time, its narrative, its story.
Right, the flow.
Yeah, the flow, and its underlying structure, the architecture, as the text puts it, the framework.
So yeah, the flow versus the form, basically.
Precisely. And the source argues that historically, listeners, even some experts, have often focused too much on one or the other. You know, they either get lost in the emotional journey or they fixate only on the structural blueprints.
Okay.
So this analysis tries to bridge that gap. It looks at the symbiotic relationship, as they call it, between narrative and architecture, how they actually work together, especially, and this is key, in performance.
So it's not just about the static plan on the page, but how it all comes alive when you hear it.
Mhm.
So what's the approach the source uses to show this connection?
Well, first they map out the skeletal structure. That's
Now,
the big picture stuff, the main keys, the large sections. Think of it like understanding the building's foundation first.
got it.
Then they look closely at the temporal processes.
Mhm.
So things like momentum, rhythm, gestures, the way the music actually unfolds moment to moment, how all that stuff transforms the structural bedrock, the basic plan, into a living musical statement.
So this sort of dry analysis of form is really just the starting point to understand how Chopin makes it breathe.
Exactly. It's about understanding both the big picture, the architecture, and the here and now details, the narrative, and crucially, how they inform each other. The analysis also, interestingly, brings in insights from some earlier critics.
Yeah.
Yeah, suggesting their initial responses were maybe more vital, more attuned to the music's life than some of the later, more critical takes.
Almost like trying to resuscitate that original, more positive view of the work.
Yes, exactly. Emphasizing that these concertos only truly make sense, as the text says, when brought to life in sound. It really highlights the performer's role in revealing this interplay between the structure and the story.
Okay, that gives us a really clear framework. Let's turn to the music itself then, starting with the F minor Concerto, Opus 21. And it's worth remembering Chopin was only 19 when he wrote this. Just incredible.
It really is.
The first movement is the maestoso.
Right. And on the surface, this movement uses a pretty conventional large-scale form, alternating orchestra and solo sections like you'd expect. And the overall tonal plan is relatively simple. It moves from the main key, F minor, to related areas like A flat major and C minor. Standard stuff, really.
And here's where the source says it gets really interesting. Despite that straightforward structure, despite his youth, the text describes an emotional unfolding of astonishing depth and subtlety. It compares him to his teachers and contemporaries, people like Hummel, Field, Fieldpiece, but argues Chopin just goes much, much further.
Absolutely. Where others might write passages that are technically tricky, but maybe musically a bit more awkward, Chopin's writing, the source says, lies naturally under the fingers, but is far more expressive. He integrates the emotional idea seamlessly, avoiding those kind of mismatched moods you sometimes find elsewhere, and the whole thing is built with solid logic.
So he's using these familiar structures, but filling them with something much more profound, much more organic. Can you give us a sense of some key moments the source points out, like the opening orchestra?
Well, played at a good pace, the source describes it as taut and exciting. It builds energy through these lively dotted rhythms and statement response patterns, really setting the stage before it winds down a bit, preparing for the piano's dramatic entry at bar 71.
And the piano comes in, plays the first theme, but then there's something special about theme 1B, right?
Yes, this is a key point in the analysis, starting around bar 82. The source calls this essentially a new theme, unique to this part of the movement, and describes it as having breathtaking effect, needing real finesse of touch and coloristic nuance.
Wow.
It's full of this expressive ornamentation, the fioritura, and a really interesting counterpoint, like subtle melodies happening underneath the main one. It builds to a powerful climax, but the source stresses how Chopin avoids just doing a typical flashy virtuoso display here. It's all integrated.
Okay, so deep expression right from the start, and the second theme.
That arrives a bit later, around bar 125. It's a beautiful, extended melody. But then instead of resolving neatly, the music hits an interrupted cadence, a kind of musical question mark, which the source says provokes a recitative-like effusion of incredible intensity.
A recitative, like in opera.
Kind of, yeah. It feels unpredictable, like a dramatic, almost spoken outburst from the piano. The mood shifts. Suddenly, the marking is conduolo, with sorrow to struggle and despair. It's a really powerful, unexpected moment in a concerto from this time.
Gosh, how does the music recover after such an emotional peak?
Well, the source argues Chopin masterfully, gradually restores momentum, bringing back a sense of flow and refinement, but with utmost refinement. He uses these beautiful flowing figurations, ascending patterns, and subtle interplay between the lines. He even brings back a flat major in a surprising, ravishing way around bar 161, adding to the richness with ingenious counterpoint.
And the analysis covers the middle part, the development, and the return of the main ideas, too.
Oh, yes. The source acknowledges that the development section, starting around bar 249, might be considered the least strong structurally by some historical critics, but it argues that even here, Chopin expertly builds momentum towards the return of the opening material. And the recapitulation, the return section starting at bar 269, is interesting. The main key, F minor, is actually quite short-lived initially. The second theme returns, again, unusually, in A flat major. And theme 1B is kind of absorbed into it, leading to this wonderful improvisatory outpouring with new embellishments before F minor is fully reestablished.
And it finishes strongly, with a kind of finale section.
Right, from bar 301 onwards, building tension from earlier ideas, using material labeled T4 in the analysis, driving towards a really defiant close. So the source summarizes this whole movement by highlighting its fluctuating intensity, the way climaxes are balanced by these reflective passages, and how everything ties together coherently through Chopin's powerful emotional argument.
And it mentions recovering a Mozartian-like balance between the piano and orchestra, and that crucial balance between structure and narrative. That's a great summary. Okay, moving to the second movement of Opus 21, the Larghetto.
Yes. The source calls this truly an exquisite tone poem. Structurally, it's simpler, basically a three-part ABA form. It moves from a flat major to a flat minor for the middle section and then back. Pretty straightforward tonally.
But what's fascinating here is the description of the piano's main melody. It's called liquid cantabile, meaning a singing, flowing style, and it's filled with what the text calls effusive ornamental melody.
Yes, absolutely. The source points out that while this kind of ornamented melody was fairly common then, Chopin's version is just emotionally more profound and musically more satisfying than his models. It argues he transcends his presumed inspiration, his admiration for the singer Konstancja Gutowska. The music goes far beyond a simple tribute.
So tell us about the narrative, the story of this movement, according to the text.
It starts beautifully, with a quiet dialogue between strings and winds in the orchestra. Then the piano enters, very resonantly. The main melody, starting at bar 7, is described as this sinuous ornamental melody, incredibly fluid in line and rhythm, with subtle counterpoint underneath. There's a simpler contrasting idea, theme B1, around bar 15, but the main focus is on that flowing line. It builds intensity gradually, reaching a conforza marking at bar 24 before the opening melody returns at bar 25, now decorated with gorgeous fioriture and these really captivating syncopations, those offbeat rhythms. There's even a sudden flare of passion around bar 28 that anticipates the darker mood of the middle section.
And that shift to A flat minor for section B.
Yes, that happens around bar 37. It introduces the dramatic core of the movement. The source describes a terrific crescendo of dramatic tension leading into a section starting at bar 45 that feels like a stylized recitativo accompagnado.
Accompanied speech again.
Exactly, like in an opera or oratorio. It alternates these slower, expressive melodic shapes with rapid, brilliant flourishes and accelerando principle, the text calls it. The melody here is labeled appassionato, full of passion, played over the shimmering tremolo accompaniment in the orchestra, something Tovey apparently admired, adding a lot of tension.
It sounds very intense.
Oh, it is. The piano part explores emotional extremes, even shifting into distant keys like G-flat major before eventually arriving at the structural dominant, the key chord pointing back home, but it's tinged, the source says, with loss and regret, a very poignant moment.
But there's a return to the initial mood eventually.
Yes, thankfully. After some optimistic touches from the winds and some piano trills, there's a brief but kaleidoscopic cadenza, a short, brilliant solo flourish at bar 72. This leads into the return of the opening section, A, at bar 75.
And how is this return described?
The opening melody comes back, but there's a kind of cathartic flourish early on, and later a celebratory effusion around bar 80, showing Chopin's complete mastery and originality. There's new figuration, leading to a final appassionato climax around bar 89 before it settles back into a flat major for the peaceful coda.
So the source really sees it as a masterpiece where these extremes of emotion are expertly juxtaposed.
Absolutely. It functions like a profound nocturne for piano and orchestra, just stunning invention and expressivity.
Okay, our final movement for Op. 21 is the Allegro Vivace. Now, the source points out something interesting about the form here. While the chapter title in the book is Rondo, the analysis suggests it's actually more complex, maybe a formal hybrid.
That's right. It's heavily influenced by the Polish Krakowiak dance, rhythmically and melodically. But structurally, the analysis argues it blends elements of a rondo, the recurring main theme, with the goal-directed feel of a sonata movement. It has this dynamic I3VI structure, moving through keys in a way that drives it forward, and the second episode functions almost like a development section.
So the narrative is clearly shaped by that Krakowiak dance.
Oh, absolutely. The opening theme, right from the soloist at bar 1, is full of that distinctive Krakowiak rhythm, very lively, syncopated with this characteristic up and down melodic arc. The source emphasizes the energy created by these contrasts and Chopin's use of variation, almost mazurka-like sometimes.
There seem to be several sections and themes in this movement.
Yes, it's quite eventful. After the main theme, there's an exuberant right-hand melody in the first episode, starting around bar 72, featuring lively dialogues between the piano and orchestra. Then the second main section, section B, starting at bar 141, introduces a whole group's 4 related themes.
4 themes.
Yeah, drawing on other Polish dances like the oberek and waltz. The source highlights how Chopin generates all this material from just tiny cells, short rhythmic or melodic ideas, and how they all share similar rhythmic profiles, giving it coherence despite the variety.
And the second episode, you said it's developmental.
Right, starting around bar 197. It begins playfully, the text says, with arpeggios emerging naturally from the previous section. But it builds intense momentum with sequential activity, frenetic, convoluted right-hand motion, and even moments of metrically fragmented dissolution. It definitely functions as a developmental phase.
And the source highlights a particularly clever moment here.
Yes. Around bar 261, there's this delightful passage where Chopin juxtaposes 2 themes from section B, vertically playing them at the same time. The source calls it a contrapuntal stroke of genius, showing how compatible his ideas are. This leads eventually to a brilliant retransition, a coruscating shower of chromatic particles back to the main theme, a really successful Spiel episode or display episode.
And the return of the main theme, the recapitulation.
It comes back around bar 325, mostly similar to the start, but Chopin throws in a surprise, an abrupt developmental variation of one of the section B themes around bar 353, adding to the dynamic feel. Then the orchestral conclusion broadens out unexpectedly to F major before the final section.
And there's a finale section or coda?
Yes, introduced by a solo horn call at bar 405. It features a new left-hand melody, but related to the B themes. It follows a typical style, brillante pattern short units building to expansive gestures, increasing tension with things like parallel diminished sevenths, reaching a huge fifth at bar 485. There's a dramatic stop, then a nostalgic return of one of the B themes before a final explosion to the end.
Wow. So the source summarizes this movement by emphasizing Chopin's mastery of handling musical impulse.
Exactly. The continual give and take between piano and orchestra, the playful tensions, and the overall seamless flow. It's seen as laying the groundwork for his later large-scale works and providing a fitting, virtuoso ending to a concerto the source clearly regards as having remarkable originality.
Okay, fantastic. Now let's move to the E minor concerto, Opus 11. And as you mentioned, this was actually written before the F minor, Opus 21, but published later.
Yeah.
It's also faced its share of criticism, particularly regarding its tonal structure.
Indeed, it has. The source acknowledges this criticism, but argues, and this is central to the reevaluation, that the very elements sometimes seen as weak, like the famous example of the second theme appearing in the wrong key, the tonic major, E major, in the exposition. Well, the source argues this actually contributes to the work's profound effect.
Ah, so the unorthodox structure isn't a flaw, it's a feature, serving some kind of emotional purpose.
That's exactly the argument. It suggests this unusual key scheme shifts the structural weight towards the end of the movement, making the final arrival and confirmation of the home key E minor feel particularly significant and hard-won.
Interesting perspective.
Oh.
Okay, let's dive into that first movement, the Allegro Maestoso. How does the source describe its narrative?
It starts with a really energetic first tutti from the orchestra. Needs a fast tempo, J126 is suggested. It features this almost lamentational chromatic descent early on, dotted rhythms, hemiolas, those rhythmic shifts, and introduces a key melodic idea, the 6-5 motive, C down to B, bar 7, which becomes a kind of fingerprint throughout the whole concerto. The source also highlights the jarring contrast between loud and soft, FTP, as a recurring feature, almost a leitmotif.
There's a contrasting second theme here too, isn't there?
Oh.
Lyrical one.
Yes, theme 2 arrives around bar 61. After all the energy and contrasts, it's described as cantabile and legato, calm and singing, offering a hiatus from the abrupt contrasts. It unfolds beautifully over 4 phrases, becoming richer harmonically, and leads to a climax before the soloist makes their grand entrance around bar 139 with a fortissimo outburst.
And the piano's first statement of the main theme, theme 1B. This sounds like a key moment in the analysis.
Oh, it absolutely is. Starting at bar 155. The piano intones this theme with what the source calls overwhelming intensity. It highlights the throbbing rhythms, the yearning melody, and these incredibly expressive, glissando-like fioriture. It describes this section, just about 20 bars, as undergoing a profound transformation compared to the orchestral version. The theme becomes far more expressive, more personal.
It really sounds like the piano isn't just playing the theme, it's interpreting it on a much deeper level.
That's precisely the feeling the source conveys. The section that follows this, episode 1, is initially more reticent, quieter, featuring innovative contrapuntal textures rather than just flashy passage work. Again, the source notes how naturally the figuration feels under the fingers.
Red build.
Oh, yes. It builds tension dramatically from around bar 203, reaching an F peak at bar 210 and arriving strongly on the dominant. The source really praises Chopin's handling here, calling its emotional logic faultless and momentum control masterful. It argues that even though the key hasn't technically modulated like in a standard sonata form, Chopin achieves that same psychological sense of departure.
Fascinating. And the return of that lyrical second theme. Around bar 222. Does it sound different this time?
Well, the theme itself is initially calm again, simple, enhanced by captivating tenor counter melodies. But the source notes how the surrounding music becomes tortured and introspective later on, bar 255, adding layers of complexity and darkness beneath the surface serenity.
Then there's a shift, a burst of E major.
Yes, quite suddenly at bar 275. This leads into what the text calls a risoluto episode from bar 283. It has a syllabatory spirit, featuring highly original figuration and some breathtaking dissonances over a dominant pedal point later on. The source notes Chopin uses a finale technique here, extending short melodic units into grander gestures.
Okay, in the development section, how does that compare to Opus 21's?
Very favorably, according to this analysis. Unlike the potential structural questions around Opus 21's development, the source calls this one potent and expertly constructed. It details its clear structure, the inventive figuration, identifying 8 distinct types, and how its sequential activity builds powerfully towards the magnificent S2 close, the end of the second theme area, and a huge F peak just before the recapitulation.
And the recapitulation itself, the return of the themes.
It starts with an abbreviated orchestral tutti, bar 486. Then the piano enters with theme 1B again, bar 510, but this time the source says it sounds almost vulnerable, perhaps because it lacks that big introductory orchestral statement it had earlier. The following episode has subtle alterations. Then the second theme returns, bar 573. And interestingly, the source says it sounds fresh and new, partly because of the harmonic context and subtle rhythmic and registral changes.
Now, here's where the source says it gets really interesting. The emotional release after this theme's return.
Yes, around bar 605. This passage is described as even more impassioned than anything before. The source uses vivid language, saying the right hand seems to improvise as a vocal melody, filled with expressive fioriture, glissandos, appoggiaturas, all those expressive vocal-like ornaments floating over a steady left-hand accompaniment.
Allowing for that bel canto rubato.
Exactly, that flexible timing like a great singer shaping a phrase. The source identifies this passage as the movement's central emotional goal, the combination of everything that's happened.
And it culminates in a finale section.
Right, from bar 621. It relates back to earlier episodes and themes, seeming to grow out of the anguish of the preceding section. It uses three-part texture, ostinato figures, building terrific momentum towards a radical sequence around bar 653, adding exciting tremolando trills, and leading eventually to that shocking interrupted cadence on C major, leaving you hanging just before the end.
Wow. So the source wraps up this incredibly complex movement by highlighting its all-embracing expressive plan, the dynamic juxtapositions, how the themes and passage work are symbiotic, and how even that idiosyncratic key scheme serves the overall emotional journey. The recitative-like passages are also seen as critical.
Yes, and the analysis is presented not just as an explanation, but as a potential strategy for performing the music, a way to unlock its power and help audiences experience it as a true masterpiece in sound.
Powerful stuff. Okay, let's move to Opelevevin's second movement, the Romance.
Yeah.
Another slow movement.
Yes, and the source calls it another finely wrought tone poem, very much drawing on the nocturne style, that beautiful singing melody, the cantilena, over an undulating left-hand accompaniment. Its ternary three-part construction, though, is described as being more complex than a typical, simple ABA structure. Figure 4.6 in the text shows this.
And again, compared to models, Chopin's approach feels far more effortlessly and integrally flowing.
Absolutely. The source argues it transcends any sense of gratuitous virtuosity. Even the orchestral introduction feels organically conceived, setting the mood beautifully and subtly using that 6/5 motive, CB, we heard in the first movement. The opening is quiet, restrained, marked J80.
The narrative starts quietly with the piano solo.
It's utterly simple at first, almost tentative, generating momentum by successive attempts to achieve melodic closure between bars 13 and 22. Then, after an orchestral link, the piano blossoms around bar 23 with a gorgeous melody over a contrapuntally rich nocturne accompaniment. The source highlights how variation infuses the music, subtly changing the melody and accompaniment each time, masking underlying similarities. The rhythm accelerates, then pulls back, the melody falls expressively, inspiring more passionate figuration and a sighing strassino, a dragging, lingering effect. It builds to a graded climax and a very sweet cadence.
And there's another section, B2.
Yes, from bar 30. Also based on repeating periods, but the source says the sheer wealth of figuration obscures this outline. It has elaborate melodic arches and chromaticism. Interestingly, the phrasing marks, the slurs, often work against the main beat, creating a kind of forward impetus. It winds down through a two-part codetta, including an exquisite fioritura at bar 49.
Then section A returns. A.
Yes, at bar 54. It's a point of return, but with richer ornamentation and breathtaking fioriture. However, the source notes hints of a darker mood, appearing some telling C naturals around bar 61.
And here's where it gets really interesting. The shift from that idyllic lyricism to anguish and agitation.
Exactly. This happens from bar 64 onwards in the agitato section C, moving to C-sharp minor. It's a dramatic change. The source points to the left-hand polyphony, the orchestral ostinato figure, and a completely new right-hand melody. This melody is described as registrally discursive, moving widely across the keyboard and rhythmically varied. Its intensity is compared to the recitative in the Op. 21 Larghetto. And again, it's shaped with Chopin's bel canto rubato.
So another moment of high drama. Does the earlier material return after this?
Yes, but developmentally. Section B returns at bar 72, shifting simply to G-sharp minor, but the source says the different ambience disguises kinship with the earlier version, B1. It features a poignant, lamentational bass descent, and the analysis suggests that the four-bar arch shape here achieves the movement's emotional peak.
And B2 returns as well.
It does, re-entering at bar 80, now in G-sharp major, with a sense of rediscovery. Again, it features new figuration, dynamics, and so on. The source points out a particularly gnarled fioritura at bar 98 and some breathtaking parallel diminished harmonies within a cadenza just before the final return of A.
Now, the final return of the main theme, A.
Right, from bar 101. This is the final statement. Interestingly, the strings take the main melody here, while the piano weaves gossamer figuration around it using cross-accentual rhythms that create a beautiful, shimmering texture.
And the coda, how does it end?
The rhythm grows more regular. It's in two parts, returning to a peaceful mood. The harmony briefly darkens, but the focus becomes fixed on the tonic key, E major. There are last-minute intonations of that 6-5 motive. The source uses lovely imagery. Half tints of an evening twilight dissolve harmoniously.
A beautiful image indeed, summing up the romance.
It's presented as showcasing Chopin's ingenious invention and effortless flow, really defining his mature compositional style, a masterpiece of expressive nuance.
Okay, finally, the last movement of Op. 11, the Rondo. The source confirms this one is explicitly called Rondo, and it's back in the tonic major, E major, also heavily influenced by the Krakowiak dance.
That's right. And while it uses a fairly standard rondo tonal scheme, IV, the source argues Chopin achieves an unprecedented degree of integration here compared to his earlier, sometimes more episodic rondos.
Right.
The 4.7 illustrates this.
So the narrative is again driven by that Krakowiak energy.
Definitely. Krakowiak rhythms and melodic cells are everywhere. It starts with a risoluto opening from the orchestra, bold statement response, using those FFPP contrasts again. Then the piano enters with its main scherzando theme, bar 17, playful, light, with an oscillating left hand, snapped rhythms, ornaments, and those characteristic Lydian fourths, sharpened fourth notes, that give it a Polish flavor.
There are various episodes and sections, like in the Opus 21 finale.
Yes. There's a developmental passage, B, an interlude derived from the theme, bar 64, described as bombastically presenting rhythms, leading to a powerful cadence featuring a syncopated Krakowiak rhythm.
Episode 1.
That starts around bar 117. It's the first explicitly loud section, FF risoluto, using announcement material in C-sharp minor, and features a distinctive passage work pattern moving sequentially towards B major.
Then section B, the contrasting section.
Right. Starting around bar 168. It has a quiet orchestral introduction, PPE leggero, with pizzicato cello providing an ostinato rhythm. Z, the piano theme here, theme 2, uses octaves and incorporates that 6-5 motive again. It's described as having a hushed if lighthearted mood, with energy coming from the strings. It builds intensity over 4 statements.
And episode 2.
This starts playfully, bar 212. The passage work builds through keys, but cleverly uses melodic ideas and rhythms from earlier sections, creating cohesion. The source notes a long linear ascent in the bass and how, even as the figuration changes, the momentum continues, delaying the reprise with highly original figuration.
Now, here's where the source says it gets really interesting. Another surprise moment.
Yes, the retransition leads, quite unexpectedly, to the listener's surprise at the false recapitulation of theme 1 in Ebb major at bar 272, a completely unrelated key. The source calls this a gentle but teasing section.
Huh. That's quite a joke. How does it get back?
Smoothly. Section A proper begins just 8 bars later, bar 280, imitating its earlier appearance. A later variation of the theme, at bar 316, has an insistent repeated note, an inverted pedal B, and a twisting quality that gives it strong closural properties, pushing towards the end. The orchestral link is then abbreviated and diverted into episode 3.
Episode 3 sounds important.
It's described as the longest and most elaborate, starting vigorously in the dominant of C-sharp minor. The source highlights its unparalleled brilliance, registral manipulation, and rhythmic variety. It builds terrific momentum towards the dominant and the final return of theme 2. It has destabilizing elements, rapid key changes, taxing figuration, dynamic contrasts, but moments of stability return.
And section B returns.
Yes, at bar 412, subtly varied again and changing direction, this time towards the home tonic, E major. Notably, this is the only time theme 2 is marked forte, loud, in the whole movement.
Leading to the finale, or coda.
Exactly, from bar 456. This section celebrates the tonic E major, attaining the highest energy level. The source details its features. Rhythmic snaps, ascending sequences, descending sequences, extended brilliant scales, parallel octaves, chromaticism, a crabbed arpeggio, a massive up-down arc across the keyboard, culminating in a scale through 4 octaves and a triumphant close with the orchestra.
So the source's summary for this rondo, emphasizes the integration again.
Yes, very much so. It notes the alternation of theme and display, the episodic structure, but emphasizes the unprecedented degree of integration, the control of impulse, and the goal-directed qualities of even the most brilliant passage work. It argues the movement adds up to much more than the sum of its parts, with everything united in expressive purpose.
Okay, fantastic. So stepping back, what does all of this deep analysis mean? Circling back to the beginning, the source acknowledges quite rightly that words can never fully capture musical experience.
That's very true. But the argument is the kind of detailed analysis it presents, tracing the narrative, understanding the structure, seeing how they connect, reveals the utter hollowness, as the text puts it, of those long-standing criticisms about these concertos lacking proper form or structure or organic development.
So instead of finding flaws, this analysis has shown evidence of genius and inspiration within the structure. It finds subtle connections, coherence, compatibility between ideas, a command of musical development that goes beyond just, repeating themes, and maybe most importantly, a clear emotional plan driving each movement.
Exactly. And crucially, the source emphasizes these qualities emerge when the works work in time, in living sound. They aren't flawed blueprints. They are dynamic musical journeys waiting to be brought fully to life in performance.
Right. Now, what about that other common criticism, the orchestration? Does the source address that?
Oh, yes, it tackles it head on. It acknowledges there are perhaps some weaknesses, judged by later romantic standards. Maybe the strings are sometimes used heavily, maybe there isn't always consistent detailed interplay between all sections, maybe some individual orchestral parts lack a bit of flair in slower passages. However, it strongly argues the orchestration is much more than just adequate. That's often the faint praise it gets. This source says, no, it's better than that.
And it can work well in performance.
Absolutely. Provided, the source suggests, performers use vital tempos, not letting things drag, and avoid creating over-rich sonorities, maybe aim for a slightly clearer, more classical balance. Then the orchestra can become a real partner to the piano, not just background support.
And the source even gives specific examples of successful orchestral writing or cooperation mentioned in the text itself.
Yes, things like the driving ostinato in the Opus 11 first movement finale, the evocative tremolo accompaniment in the romance's middle section, the way the orchestra grounds the piano's flexible rhythm in the second themes of both third movements, or in Opus 21, the punctuating winds and brass in the first movement tutti, the atmospheric support in the larghetto's recitative, the canonic touches, and in Opus 11's first movement tutti, those horn octaves and wind dialogues. Lots of effective moments. Okay, so where does this story actually begin? Because the idea of a third concerto shows up surprisingly early, according to the records.
It does. Way back in December 1830, Chopin's in Vienna writing letters, and he mentions this plan for a concerto. But wait for it, for two pianos.
Right, with the Tomás Nidecki, I remember reading that.
Exactly. But it seems like that specific idea, the two-piano version, kind of fizzled out pretty quickly. Abandoned.
But the idea of a third concerto, maybe for solo piano, didn't just vanish, did it?
Not at all. And this is where it gets really interesting. It pops up again in letters a few years later, mid-1830s. His dad, Nicolas Chopin, writes about it in 34 and 35. And he sounds, well, a little worried. He mentions doubting it was finished and expresses concern about the, quote, mental tension it was causing Frederick.
Oh, wow. So it was maybe a difficult project for him even then.
Seems like it. And it wasn't just family talk either. The research shows that right around the same time, late 1834, publishers were actually discussing it.
Actively, like wanting to publish it.
Yeah. There's correspondence between Breitkopf and Hertel and their guy in Paris, Heinrich Probst. They're talking about engraving Chopin's Concertos Nos. 2 and 3.
Number 3. So they thought it existed or it was close.
Exactly. They were even haggling over price, throwing around figures like 800 to 1,000 francs, then maybe 600, maybe down to 500, 600.
Okay, so that tells us something significant. The piece must have been, reasonably far along for Probst to think he could actually get it. It wasn't just a vague idea.
Precisely. Which leads to another question that the sources bring up. Could some version of it have actually been performed early on?
Performed where?
Well, the book mentions this note about Chopin playing un magnifique concerto de piano, a magnificent piano concerto at a Schlesinger soirée, like a musical evening, in February 1834.
Okay. But which concerto? Could it have been Opus 11, the E minor? It wasn't published yet.
That's the mystery. Or could it possibly have been an early version of the piece that became Opus 46? The sources are clear. We just don't know for sure. It's tantalizing, though.
It really is. So for a long time, scholars kind of assumed, based on the style and these hints, that Opus 46 must have come from these earlier third concerto plans.
Right. It made sense, but the book highlights this crucial piece of evidence that really nails the connection.
Yes, the letter. This is key.
Tell us about it.
So it's a previously unpublished letter from Chopin himself, writing to Breitkopf and Hartel in September 1841. Just before Opus 46 was published.
Okay.
And in it, he explicitly offers them an Allegro maestoso du ten concerto por piano solo, Allegro maestoso from the third concerto, for piano alone, for 1,000 francs.
Wow. So he calls it that himself. Allegro maestoso. That's the tempo marking and the opening of Opus 46. Wow.
Exactly. In his own words, he's identifying this solo piano piece as the first movement from his third concerto, just arranged for piano solo. That makes the connection, as the source says, crystal clear.
Crystal clear. And it doesn't stop there, does it? There are later references, too.
That's right. Later that same year, October 1841, he writes to his friend and copyist Fontana. He mentions sending the manuscript concerto, the manuscript of the concerto.
Which we know was Opus 46.
Which was Opus 46. And even a few days later, when he's talking about the minimum price Fontana should accept for it, 600 francs, he still calls it the Allegro maestoso.
So the evidence seems pretty solid then. The piece we know as Opus 46 definitely evolved from this long gestating idea for a third concerto.
Yes. Which brings us right back to that central puzzle the chapter tackles. Okay, if Opus 46 has roots in the early 1830s, and it's full of that brilliant, maybe slightly old-fashioned style brillante, why on earth did Chopin decide to publish this piece in 1841?
Yeah, when his style had supposedly moved on so much, he was in that period of stylistic consolidation, as the source called it. More refined, more complex harmonies, different forms. It seemed like an odd throwback.
The sources suggest a few possible reasons, kind of weaving together a story. First off, the dedicatee.
Friedrich Müller, his pupil.
Exactly. A very talented pupil, apparently. Liszt even supposedly nicknamed her Mademoiselle Opus 46.
That's great.
She studied with him right up until 1841, and she later recalled that Chopin actually promised her a concert piece dedicated to her when she left. So maybe publishing Opus 46 was, in part, fulfilling that promise, giving her something substantial that suited her abilities.
Okay, that's one factor. What else?
Well, factor two might be Chopin's own experiences performing his other concertos, particularly the E minor, Opus 11.
What about them?
The book mentions an account by someone named Sowerinsky who saw Chopin perform and said he was distressed and dismayed by the incomprehension his concerto received.
Incomprehension, like the audience didn't get it.
Could be that. Or it could relate to a known problem. The orchestral parts in his concertos aren't always, well, the most effective. And maybe his very delicate, nuanced playing just didn't mesh well with how orchestras typically played back then. It got lost, or the accompaniment felt clumsy.
Right, I've heard that criticism about the orchestration. So how does that link to Opus 46?
Well, the third idea, which is a bit more speculative, connects these points. Maybe that disappointment with how Opus 11 landed in performance, potentially hampered by the orchestra, made him shelve the third concerto idea originally.
Because he didn't want to repeat.
Perhaps. But then, years later, 1841, maybe prompted by the promise to Müller, feeling enough time had passed since Opus 21 came out. He decides to take that old concerto material and reshape it as a solo piece.
So he could control everything. No orchestra to worry about.
Exactly. It lets him showcase, as the source puts it, his technical prowess and bel canto sound alike, without any risk of it being compromised by a subpar orchestra. It's his vision, pure and direct. A piece destined to satisfy a larger audience in a style universally well-received.
That makes a certain kind of sense. Taking control.
And by 1841, he could also bring his later skills to it, Even if the core material was older, he could weave in newer virtuoso techniques, maybe some things he picked up from Liszt, and use his more sophisticated formal tricks, like that apotheosis idea where a theme comes back bigger and grander.
So enhancing the old material.
Right, to create that profound effect he might have felt was denied to him earlier with the orchestral concerto.
There's also that really poignant detail mentioned about Warsaw.
Oh, yes, the A. Hoffman account. That Chopin apparently held this piece in really high regard and reportedly said something like, "This is the very first piece I shall play in my first concert upon returning home to a free Warsaw."
Wow. So he was tied up with his hopes for Poland, too. Adds another layer entirely.
It really does. So you've got this mix. Old ideas, a student's talent, past frustrations, new techniques, maybe even patriotism, all possibly swirling around the decision to publish Opus 46 as a solo piece in 1841.
Okay, so given all that complex background,
Yeah.
how did people actually react when it came out? Was it hailed as this great solo work?
Well, the critical reception was, let's just say, mixed, right from the start.
Not universally loved.
Not quite. The earliest review mentioned by Maurice Bourges in 1842 was actually quite positive. He thought it could satisfy a larger audience, like the majestic introduction, the melodies, the light and brilliant figuration. He called the style universally well received without, however, being vulgar. Sounds pretty good, right?
Yeah, sounds like a thumbs up.
But then you get Schumann reviewing it the same year, and he's less impressed.
What didn't Schumann like?
He recognized it clearly started as a concerto first movement, but he felt it lacked a really beautiful singing melody, a cantabile. He said it meanders restlessly. And crucially, he felt it was incomplete without a slow movement and finale. He was basically judging it against the concerto it wasn't.
So judging it for what it wasn't rather than what it was. That's a recurring theme, isn't it?
It seems to be. And that raises the question of how we should listen to it. As a finished solo piece, or always with the ghost of the orchestra.
And did the criticism stay at that level, or did it get harsher?
Oh, it got much harsher later on, decades later. The sources point particularly to Niecks, writing almost 50 years after publication. He was brutal, called it unsatisfactory, nay, almost indigestible.
Indigestible.
Wow. He found the musical ideas neither striking nor important, and felt the orchestral bits still sounded heavy and clumsy, like a bad arrangement, even when played solo.
Ouch. Did anyone agree with him?
Honecker did, referencing Niecks. He basically said it adds little to Chopin's reputation, but even these really negative critics had to admit one thing.
What was that?
The sheer difficulty, the virtuosity.
Okay. They couldn't deny the pyrotechnics.
Exactly. Even while criticizing it, Honecker mentioned its risky skips and ambuscades of dangerous double notes. And another critic, G.C. Ashton Johnson, was amazed that modern virtuosi weren't playing it more. He said flat out that nothing Liszt wrote topped its pianistic brilliance, and that playing it needed the highest artistic intelligence.
So respect for the technique, even if they didn't love the music itself.
Pretty much. And there were other views too. Some saw it as a kind of hollow victory, others as just a sketch. One rather cynical take was that Chopin just needed the money and dusted off old stuff.
So really all over the map. What about more recently? Have views softened?
Thankfully, yes. The sources mention more recent scholars being much more generous. Peter Gould finds it absorbing and indeed fascinating, acknowledging inconsistencies but also seeing superb inspiration and blazing originality.
That's a different tune.
And Jim Sampson calls it a fascinating and teasing work and highlights that its virtuosity exceeds almost anything else Chopin wrote.
So a reappraisal happening. Sampson also made a point about the form, didn't he? That maybe it wasn't as formally chaotic as some early critics thought.
Right. He points out that tonally, the key structure, it's actually pretty conventional compared to the other concertos. It goes from A major to the dominant E major and back via the minor, standard stuff.
So the wanting form wasn't about confusing keys.
Not necessarily. It was more about the structure, things like not having a full development section for the soloist or how the recap merges back in. Those were the unconventional choices that maybe bothered people and led some to try and fix it later with arrangements.
Okay, let's talk about the music itself then. What does it actually sound like when you get past the history and the criticism? The sources really stress listening, don't they?
They absolutely do. They argue you have to hear it performed well to grasp its profound effect. You need to focus on the sound, not just the score or its messy backstory. Similar to the other concertos in a way, but maybe for different reasons here.
So structurally, you hear those alternating tutti and solo sections like a concerto first movement.
Yes, very much so. It starts with that big allegro maestoso opening, feels like the orchestra. Quite grand, almost theatrical, more like a French opera overture than a typical classical tutti. It has different themes building up to a triumphant close.
And then the piano comes in.
Right, after a sort of hesitant little flourish. But interestingly, it doesn't play the main theme from the opening. It introduces its own theme, very pianistic. The source calls it confident, even bombastic at one point, and it highlights an unusual texture, right-hand octaves used just for sheer force, not melody. That's a bit different for Chopin.
Interesting. And then the fireworks start.
Pretty soon after, you get the first big virtuosic section, the Spiel episode. This is where the style brillante really kicks in. Dazzling scales, arpeggios, complex figures flying everywhere. The source notes the extraordinary surface complexity, but also points out the sophisticated harmony underneath it all before it leads into the second main theme.
What's that theme like?
It's simply more lyrical, arriving in the dominant key, E major, but it builds intensity too, especially in its second phrase, which features what the source calls a Lisztian crescendo in octaves. Again, that emphasis on powerful octave writing.
So moments of flashiness even within the lyrical theme.
Definitely. Then after more virtuosic passages full of sequences and these interesting harmonic crunches, acciacaturas, that second theme comes back. But here's a really striking moment. It returns in A minor, the tonic minor.
Shift in mood.
A big shift. The source describes it as a moment of introspection, giving it a feeling of hollow melancholy. It's a sudden pocket of darkness amidst all the brilliance.
But it doesn't stay dark.
No, the mood brightens again. That same theme is then restored to a major, but now it sounds grander, fuller, texturally richer. This is that apotheosis. The source mentions the theme returning, elevated, often with powerful keyboard textures, like another big crescendo.
And how does it wrap up?
It moves into a kind of finale section. Starts gently, but builds again in intensity and technical demand. It drives towards a final tutti eruption, with the soloist getting one last brilliant outburst. The source specifically mentions cascading double octaves near the end, a real showstopper, maybe even designed, they speculate, to make the audience erupt in applause.
You can really hear why people found the form unusual, but also why it's so demanding, and why some people tried to fix it later.
Exactly. Code wrote these huge arrangements, adding a development, another tutti, a full recap, trying to make it fit the standard mold. Others, like Niecks, hated that. And ironically, Wilkomirski's orchestration from the 30s actually seemed to reduce the soloist's role, kind of defeating Chopin's possible purpose and making it a solo piece.
It's quite a saga. So what about playing it? What does it take? You mentioned the difficulty.
Yeah, the sources are unanimous on that. It demands a different kind of virtuosity than much of Chopin's other music. More power, maybe. Those powerful octaves, risky skips, and dangerous double notes. It's just relentlessly challenging. Some suggest writing a virtuoso piece in a major key itself posed different technical challenges.
And are the recordings that really capture it well? The sources mention a few.
They do. Michael Ponti recorded that Wilkomirski orchestral version, which is interesting to hear. But focusing on the solo piano original, Claudio Arau's 1956 recording gets special mention.
What did they like about Arau's?
They felt it was particularly well conceived. Arau apparently navigated the structure logically, moving from the grand opening through all the episodes to the lively finish, balancing the brilliance with that touch of nostalgia or melancholy, making sense of the whole journey. Though they do note, technically, his tempo sometimes felt more like 4 beats per bar than the written to.
Huh. A minor quibble. How did others compare?
Well, Nikita Makalov's later recording, while correctly in 2 beats per bar, is described as having an overslow tempo, which could make it drag. Roger Woodward's apparently had even less impulse, but they also praise Barbara Hesukowska's recording from around 1958 as stylistically admirable, capturing a light and pearly virtuosity within a lively pulse.
So performance really matters. Hearing a great interpretation like Arau's, perhaps, helps reveal those hidden virtues the sources talk about, things you might miss just reading the score or those old negative reviews.
Absolutely. It brings the piece off the page and shows its potential impact. The music makes its own argument in sound.
Okay, so let's try and sum up this journey. We have the Allegro de Concert, Opus 46. Its origins are mysterious, likely starting as this third concerto idea in the early 1830s.
Right. Then unexpectedly published as a solo piece in 1841, maybe due to a mix of things. A promise to a student, frustration with orchestras, wanting solo success, maybe even that dream of playing it in a free Warsaw.
It got a really mixed reception, praised by some early on, then really slammed by later critics, even while they admitted its incredible difficulty. And the whole narrative, the disappointment, Mueller, the Warsaw Dream, the sources acknowledged this might be partly speculative and extravagant fiction, like other Chopin legends.
It's a good point to remember.
But, and this is a key insight from the reading, even if it is partly fiction, these stories aren't useless. They can be legitimate ways of interpreting the music, guiding performers and listeners, helping us grasp, as the source says, some aspect of the music's elusive meaning. They shape how we hear it.
Exactly. They provide a lens. So those hidden virtues, the cleverness in its form, even if unconventional, the technical innovation, the pacing, the emotional contrasts, they arguably justify seeing the piece much more favorably than history often has.
Which leaves us with a final thought, perhaps. How much of our understanding of any piece of art is fixed, and how much is constructed? How much does our perception change based on new evidence, different interpretations we hear, or just the stories we tell about it?
That's the provocative question, isn't it? If you go and listen to Chopin's Allegro de Concert now, armed with this complicated, fascinating, maybe slightly legendary backstory, what will you hear in it? What meaning will emerge for you?
Thank you so much for listening. We hope this episode has given you meaningful insights and sparked your interest in the book we explored today. Just a reminder, this is only a brief summary and not a substitute for the full reading experience. We encourage you to read the original book to truly appreciate its depth. If you found this content helpful, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss future episodes. And if you'd like to support our channel, feel free to share this video with friends. Every share helps our community grow.